Okay, so we'll begin. I'm going to formally introduce Dr. Debbie Corin, and she is an independent researcher in the field of halacha and responsa literature with a book published, as we mentioned, by Academic Studies Press entitled Responsa in a Historical Context, A View of Post-Expulsion Spanish-Portuguese Jewish Communities Through 16th and 17th Century Responsa. She has lectured and taught in Talmud and halacha, informal and formal adult settings. In her prior life, she worked in high tech in the field of computer networking, and she has a PhD in mathematics from the City University of New York and an MA in Talmud and halacha from the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. And as she told us, she's coming in from Jerusalem. So, Debbie, the floor is yours. And let me just remind people, if you have questions throughout, you can send it in the chat. Unless it's a detail in the middle, I won't interrupt you, Debbie, with the questions. I'll keep them till the end. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. I hope more people will join, but let's go. Yeah, so Dalia, you're Dalia, right? You didn't introduce yourself. You just said you're filling in for Drora. Mention the name of my book, and yes, it is about responsa from Sephardic communities. But this time, I'm going to be speaking about a responsum from an Ashkenazi community. And I was asked to speak about a responsum connected to Passover, given how close we are to that holiday, and in a historical context, which is the way that I approach responsa, and that's something I enjoy. So a brief comment to those who are less familiar with responsa literature. In Hebrew, we use the acronym SHUT, which is an acronym for She'elot u'Tshuvot, which means questions and answers. We rarely will say it in full, in the singular. In other words, you won't hear somebody say a She'elah u'Tshuvah. You will more likely say so-and-so, typically a rabbi, wrote a tshuva rather than a she'elah tshuva. There's always a question with it, though, or always let's say, at least a presumed question with it. Sometimes the question is actually not clearly articulated, but from the response, you see what he's addressing. I have to keep glancing at notes here so I don't forget things. The responsa are usually answering a question that was submitted, typically submitted by another rabbi to a higher authority, to a rabbi that's more recognized. It is rarely submitted by just an individual person. Although people these days, it's not responsive when you go on the internet and you ask a question, oh, can I eat this? Or those things are not really responsive. Those are things that anybody who knows how to access the literature can figure out for themselves. Responsa are generally addressing questions that are not easily found right away in the literature, or maybe there's no precedent yet, or there's very little precedent, or the precedent is something that's not so well known. And then you need a higher authority to either know these precedents or to search them, or to actually come up with his own. And I say his own because until the 21st century, maybe the end of the 20th century, it was always a guy. So it's always a male rabbi. So a rabbi or a chacham in the Sephardi community, we would say it's a chacham who's responding to these questions. The questions can relate to every aspect of Jewish life, whether on ritual matters, which is what I think most people these days tend to think of, but it was marriage and divorce, extremely common, inheritance issues, civil disputes, just about everything. But they almost always rely heavily on halachic sources. The question and the response that I chose to present is relating to the Jews in the Kingdom of Westphalia. Now, not so many people are familiar with Westphalia, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. It was written by Rabbi Mendel Sternhardt, And I say it was presented as a question because we can't be totally certain that in this case, Rabbi Sternhardt or other people that worked with him, and I will tell you momentarily who worked with him, didn't actually compose this question themselves. In other words, it might not have actually come from the field, so to speak. It might have even come from the rulers, and I will talk about that just in a moment, of Westphalia. So we'll say it was presented as a question, but he might have had an agenda in mind that is not, it's much less common, but it's not a rare occurrence in responsa literature. After we read the question and portions of the response, we might want to discuss what agenda he might have had, what his motivations were, and I don't know whether you think he composed the question or someone presented it. So let's talk about Westphalia and Rabbi Sternhardt's position there. I'll quote from Wikipedia. It's actually as good a source as any on Westphalia. The map on Wikipedia, I didn't bring a map to show because none of the maps are really terrific, but the map on Wikipedia is at least accurate. The map in the Britannica is not. So Napoleon Bonaparte founded the Kingdom of Westphalia as a client state of the First French Empire in 1807. He named the historical region he named it Westphalia. There's a historical region of Westphalia, but actually where he called the Kingdom of Westphalia was not really Westphalia. It included Hessian, Angrian, and Eastphalian territories, and only a small part of it was overlapping with what's Westphalia. If you look at a map of Germany, we don't really see where the Kingdom of Westphalia, although I think actually the region Westphalia might show up on some detailed maps that break Germany up into its states. But Westphalia really is more to the west in Germany, and then there's Eastphalia. And they're both towards the north. But the Kingdom of Westphalia was actually more towards the east. Why he decided to call it the Kingdom of Westphalia is anyone's guess. We really don't know. And here's a quote again from Wikipedia, different article. The region mostly covered territory formerly known as Eastphalia. The province of Westphalia was established only in 1815. This already is not part of the quote. And the Kingdom of Westphalia lasted from 1807, which is when I said Napoleon founded it, until 1813. It was ruled by Napoleon's youngest brother, Jerome. Yeah, we could call him a Nepo baby these days, right? And Napoleon probably regretted his decision because the reason for its short existence is substantially due to Jerome's rather extravagant spending, which bankrupted his kingdom. He would go out to battle, and take the fanciest things. He basically spent way over what he should be. So we can imagine that Napoleon regretted his choice. The Allied Prussian and Russian forces that defeated Jerome's force, they defeated Jerome's force before the French forces could come, or reinforcements could come and back him up. And so the kingdom was dissolved in 1813. The people who read War and Peace, right, or have read War and Peace, it's a great book, and think of 1812 and so forth. Well, this is just happening around that time. And yeah, Napoleon, this was actually one of the defeats, the defeat of the Kingdom of Westphalia. His final defeat was in 1815. And at that point, the former Westphalian territories were incorporated into a German confederation with Austrian leadership, along with the rest of the German states. In 1808, so remember it was founded in 1807. In 1808, the kingdom passed Germany's first laws granting Jews equal rights, thereby providing a model for reform in the other German states. Under these new laws, and this was pretty radical for the time, Jews were permitted to settle throughout the kingdom, to engage in the profession of their choice, and to have total freedom of commerce. Considering these laws, plenty of Jews will think of Napoleon as good for the Jews. But in fact, these liberal laws attracted more Jews to the kingdom, so that by 1810, there were about 19,000. We think of that, what's 19,000 Jews? But at that time, 19,000 Jews in any one community is actually pretty large. Ashkenazi communities were typically really tiny, sometimes barely a million. There were, throughout Germany before this time, laws on how many people could move into how many Jews could be in a Jewish community. You needed permission to marry in order to increase the population of that place, and they didn't necessarily permit. So having 19,000 Jews is that's pretty amazing for 1810. But the Orthodox were not pleased with the responsibilities that came with these equal rights, such as serving in Napoleon's army. And they also weren't too pleased with the innovations in religious services that were introduced. Napoleon's motivation was far from being out of his love for the Jews. There's an abundance of literature that discusses his motivations. His conflicting attitudes towards Jews, actually not very positive. In other words, statements he made about Jews were clearly had all the anti-Semitic tropes in them. Briefly, I could say that Napoleon's mindset was in many ways similar to the Australian government's attempt at assimilating the Aboriginal population in Australia during the period of forced removal from families of those children who could blend in, right? This is known, this was done, and the attitude was, if we get them to blend in, the Aboriginal population will disappear. That was the same with Napoleon. He was hoping that by assimilation, he wouldn't force it like they were trying to do in Australia, but he went so far to encourage it, hoping to transform Jews into good Frenchmen, just like he became. He wasn't originally a Frenchman, he was a Corsican, and he became a good Frenchman, and he felt the Jews should be able to do that too. He even asked the Consistoire, which was the religious committee in France at the time under his rule, to justify why they think Jews are not permitted to intermarry. So unlike, well, let's say if you want to contrast to Nazi Germany, that intermarriage was something that was forbidden, Napoleon encouraged it because he felt you intermarry, you'll assimilate, and you'll become good Frenchmen. So we're not gonna discuss this more because that's like a side topic, but I wanted to include sufficient background so that you understand the setting for the responsum that I wish to present. If anybody's interested, you can just send me a message. In a brief article that paints Napoleon's attitude towards the Jews as being very negative, actually, this article, in contrast to quite commonly held ideas, you can contact me for a link. There's an article that I thought was quite good in the San Diego Jewish World, written a number of years ago by Alex Gordon. So following the French example of the Consistoire, a consistory, Consistoire Israelite, was established in Westphalia to supervise the Jewish congregations. Its president was Israel Jacobson. He was an educated person, a former merchant, the financial advisor to King Jerome Bonaparte. Now, I'm not happy he was the financial advisor because Jerome Bonaparte basically bankrupted the place, and then in the end, they'll say it was the Jews' fault. But nevertheless, he was the financial advisor. He was assisted by rabbis Loeb Meir Berlin, Simon Kalkar, and Mendel Sternhardt, who was the author of this responsum that we're going to be looking at. There were a couple of other scholars and some other participants in the Consistoire. The task was the supervision of all Jewish activities in Westphalia. And among Napoleon's goals for the consistory, Consistoire, was to educate the young generation to have productive skills and professions, rather than only money lending, for example, though they did have some other trades. So this was part of, we know of someone else, a later time in Europe, not that much later though, Joseph II, who had a similar idea that Jews will contribute more to our society if we actually permit them to work in more professions, and we therefore have to educate them. Orthodox didn't necessarily like it because it's not we have to educate them, we kind of require that they become educated. So we don't know the motivation of Rabbi Sternhardt because he had a rather typical Orthodox rabbinical education and trajectory as a rabbi. Why did he cooperate with Jerome Bonaparte? Not clear, but he did. He was the first German rabbi to remove certain parts of the traditional prayer service. And he was among the first German rabbis to give his sermons in German. For those people who are familiar with reaction to that, rabbis like the Hatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, was extremely opposed to giving drashot or divrei Torah in German rather than in Yiddish. That was a step to reform. So why he did this, we really won't know, but he did. As is known, Napoleon drafted citizens of his empire to serve in his army, and many Jews, whether by choice to prove that they were worthy citizens or not by choice because they were drafted, were among those who were recruited into the army of Westphalia. So now with that background, we can read the question posed to, or perhaps not posed to, but composed by Rabbi Sternhardt. It was published in 1812, though possibly written a little bit before that, by his brother, by his friend, Binyamin Ze'ev Hindenheim. Okay. He was learned in liturgy and Hebrew language, and he published Machzorim and Sidurim. And I'm going to translate with a fairly close reading, but not exactly literate because some things don't translate well literally into English. And you might notice, it might be a little bit harder to tell from the English, but you might notice that some of the phrases are actually based on biblical phrases, which is a very common linguistic technique in Responsa literature. For those who are either read my book or interested in reading my book, in all of my translations there, I cite on what biblical verse the author of a responsum is basing or quoting, so that you can see the flow of how the biblical language just works its way into the Hebrew fluidly. It's really beautiful. Okay, so we were asked by those who fear and tremble, right? The word haredim is used to tremble, the original meaning, not the meaning we have today, about the word of the Lord. Behold, now it will be said to Jacob and the house of Israel, choose men from among you for the army. This is actually something, if you think of Hechalatzu, he's using the Hebrew word before the Israelites are entering the land of Israel and says, choose people, Moshe says, to enter. That's where that language is coming from. Prepare yourselves and come into a covenant with us to do the king's law as one of his people. And each one will help his brother, for you are the same as us, with a portion and inheritance in the land. The land is wide before you. Return and trade in it and possess it. So he's phrasing it as this is what Napoleon's government, or Jerome, I should say, Jerome's government said. And he's obviously putting it in a very positive light. We're now being welcomed to join as equals with all the other citizens. To possess the land, which, yes, being able to own land is, for Jews at the time, really an amazing allowance. Okay? And to trade in it, possess it. However, our hearts will tremble if it will be Passover for the Jews, and the men of war are encamped in a camp or within a city or a village where no Jew lives. What will these soldiers of the army from among our people, who would not redeem themselves by eating the king's food? That he's using language from this book of Daniel, Pat Bad Hamelech, which means the food, literally the bread from the king's kitchen, right? Daniel, in the book of Daniel, he won't eat food that might not be kosher, so as not to transgress the prohibition that is so severe as to have a punishment of karet, God forbid. The punishment of karet is excommunication of the soul. It's not something that happens on earth, but it's excommunication of the soul. What that actually means, we don't know what it means, but the term karet is used in the Torah, and it is considered a severe punishment, but something that is not done by a beit din, by a court, and rather is something that is done, like, I don't know, somehow by God or by heaven, or however that happens. But it is one of the most, there are very, well, let's put it this way, eating chametz on Pesach is one of those sins that is punishable by karet, and other severe sins as well. So let's just leave it that way. Then he continues, they face the negative transgression of do not eat chametz, where we have mitzvot lo ta'aseh, do not do, but also the inability to perform the positive commandment to eat matzah. So we have two problems here. They can't abstain from chametz if they have nothing to eat, but they also may not have matzot, and they can't do the positive commandment. Which is the worst one? Ideas, I see, that's why I like people to talk back. The worst one is to transgress the negative commandment, to eat chametz. That's worse than not being able to eat matzah. That's the one that has the punishment of karet. So he's saying they face both of these problems because sometimes they are far from a Jewish community, have no contact with a Jew, and even a person who is pure and fears God ceases to fully keep Passover as commanded when on a journey far from the cities of Israel. But he's at the Russian front. What's he going to do? Because he does not have the ability to bring sufficient matzah on Passover to fill his need, so that he will starve. And through this, they are driven from their work and are brought to disgrace and shame, because the king is not saved by the multitude of a weak army. So he's not just concerned about the fact that they are transgress the prohibition to eat chametz. He's not just concerned about the fact that they can't eat matzah, but he's concerned about the fact that they will be so hungry that they won't be able to be good soldiers. How could you be a good soldier if you're starving? So they'll bring disgrace and shame. Here, finally, Jews are part with everybody else, and people are going to say, what, these Jews can't do anything. They're weak, because the king is not saved by the multitude of a weak army if they do not eat till they're full. And now our lives and that of our people depend upon this question, right? It is not just the army. It's, in a sense, the reputation of the Jewish people in Westphalia. Is it not possible to find a solution for these men of war to allow them rice and millet and types of legumes in which there is no fear of leavening? Further, we have also heard that those in Arabia, that's presumably the Persian and Babylonian Jews who are not Sfaradim, because then he says, and the Sfaradim eat them on Passover. It's interesting that he says, we have heard. What do you mean you have heard? It's that way in the Shulchan Aruch. It's well known that all of those Jews don't abstain from eating what we call Qitniyot, or legumes, on Passover. So to say we have heard is a little strange. So that these people will not be forced to eat on chametz on Passover, God forbid. So basically what he's saying is, other Jews eat them. Shouldn't we permit these soldiers to do so? And when we saw that people were speaking rightly, so now he's saying that was the question. When we saw these people were speaking rightly, and that the time of Passover was approaching, the head of the speakers, the Lord President Jacobson, remember that he heads this Consistoire, who is also well-versed in the Bible, the Mishnah, and the Gemara, requested that the rabbis sitting in the Consistory should examine and consider what to do about this matter. So the way he's presenting it, it's the head of the Consistoire that asked him to respond to this. Did he come up with this on his own? Did people present it to him? Did some soldiers say, what are we going to eat? That's what's not clear. But in any event, he does answer this. He requested the rabbi sitting in his consistory should examine and consider what to do about this matter, whether to permit or prohibit according to the law of our holy Torah, and to bring our words and agreements to the consistory when it convenes, so that we might know what to do. And so we did everything he requested of us, and each of us took the matter to heart. And we ordered our members to consult the Shas, that's the Talmud, and the Poskim, the other authorities, in order to understand the matter and to issue a correct decision. Then we convened, and each of us presented his idea before his colleagues. So the way he's explaining it, he didn't just write this on his own, but they basically each studied the matter and then discussed the matter, and he is the person that is writing the conclusions. We examined this matter, combined all aspects, and with all the reasons that we found and that God gave us, we agreed together to permit various kinds of legumes without any doubt in the world, and not only for the soldiers, but for every Jew residing in the Kingdom of Westphalia. And this might be where he damaged his case. And what I mean by damaged his case, because once he's making it, it's not something because of an urgent situation. It's not something that in Hebrew we would call she'at d'chak, just of extreme necessity, a moment of extreme necessity. He's saying all the Jews in the Kingdom of Westphalia should be able to eat these legumes. Now, we will see that logically that might make sense, but tactically, he might have ruined it. At this point, Rabbi Sternhardt elaborates in a very extensive response in which he draws from a large number of halachic sources, Talmud, Rishonim, those are the, we'll call them the authorities from before the Shulchan Aruch, and Aharonim, after the Shulchan Aruch. I won't read the response. It's quite long, and it would require a lot of explanation to understand the halachic arguments, and I'm sure among you there are people with a wide variety of backgrounds, but I'll summarize his main points and method. He divides his argument into two issues. One, can rice, millet, and all sorts of legumes ferment? In other words, can they become chametz? This is actually discussed plenty times in plenty places, including in the Talmud, which is why it became halacha until the Ashkenazim took upon themselves the stringency that they can be used on Pesach. And two, even if they don't ferment, should they be forbidden because of an existing custom? And remember, this is only an Ashkenazi custom. It's one of those times that all those people who are not Ashkenazi can walk around smug on Pesach and say, we don't have to suffer the way you do. To answer the first question, the question, can they ferment? He cites the Gemara, in which we find the accepted position that they do not ferment. So I just said, yes, this is an old question, and they already concluded there. There is a minority opinion, but that's not the accepted by any of the Amoraim, Geonim, or Rishonim. In other words, there's a minority opinion in the Gemara that they can ferment, but that's not the conclusion, not the accepted by all the way through, and a whole slew of poskim, or authorities, who overwhelmingly permit use of rice, millet, and legumes. When you go through the whole slew of poskim, it's a halachic method that I remember one of my teachers at Machon Shechter, one of my professors there, would call the bean counting method of ruling, meaning you cite 20 different people that will say one way, and you can only find 5 who will find the other way, and so let's go with the 20. The minority who prohibited as a siak, meaning an extra guard or a preference for stringency, gave one of several explanations. such as bread can be made from legumes. Now, it's interesting that they thought of that. In those days, only very poor people might do that. But these days, we see in the health food stores, right, all these different lentil flour, rice flour, this flour, that flour, whether it's for people who are avoiding gluten, whether it's for all kinds of reasons. And yeah, you can make bread, but I don't think it fools anyone. It's not bread. It's because it's missing its gluten is one reason. Anyway, that is one of the explanations. Another is that grains can get mixed with legumes. That is something that people who do eat rice will often sift through it to be sure that there aren't any wheat grains mixed in there. Pretty rare these days, I think, but I guess it could happen. Rabbi Sternhardt presents arguments in opposition to each of the explanations given, but he basically returns to his fundamental argument that the majority of poskim never prohibited due to these concerns. He cites a complete, lengthy responsum written by, we say, Yavetz, the Yavetz, who's Rabbi Yaakov Emden Ben Tzvi, the son of the Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi goes by the title as if he's a Sephardi rabbi, but he wasn't. He was Ashkenazi, but he served Sephardi communities. And so therefore he became known as the Chacham Tzvi. And because he served Sephardi communities, he came to accept the Sephardi custom, which once upon a time, it was called Minhag HaMakom. You do things according to what was in wherever the majority of the people in that locale did. It's when people came to large, I guess, so-called melting pots like the United States, where, for example, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein would be troubled. I mean, when Ashkenazi Jews first came to the United States, what was Minhag HaMakom? The first Jews who settled in the United States were all Sephardi Jews. Well, he wasn't quite willing to give up his Ashkenazi customs. And so that became, and it wasn't just him, it became that everybody does what their families did. But once upon a time, it wasn't like that. You move to a community, you do what the community does. In Israel, the same thing. I mean, actually, that was one of the reasons Rav Ovadia Yosef kept insisting that the custom in Israel should be according to Rabbi Karo, according to Shulchan Aruch, because that's who was here. But people do cling to their customs. Usually, I think in Israel, more and more people are going over to the, sure, why not eat Qitniyot? All these, half the population here does anyway. So I think other than certain segments of the population, that will become more and more the norm in this country. Anyway, the Chacham Tzvi took this custom. His son, who already was not in a Sephardi community, but he was totally convinced by it, and so he wrote a rather lengthy responsum on the subject, permitting them, even though he's Ashkenazi. Rabbi Sternhardt cited actually this entire responsum from the Yavetz because he said the book is hard to find. Well, these days it's not so hard to find, but I guess at his time it was. And he points out, Yavetz, that aside from the citation of a multitude of sources, leniency, if that's what it is when we're talking about a stringency, I don't think it really is a leniency. It is like the halacha, and then you have a stringency. So if you just go to the baseline and don't add the stringency, then it relieves the community of an unnecessary burden. And that's how he looked at it. The second portion of the response addresses the matter of canceling a custom. The halachic question is stated as, regarding things that are permitted, but others have forbidden them for themselves by taking a vow, for example. Is it permitted to cancel them for those who took the vow? And this is in the Talmud, in the Yerushalmi as well, but there's also something in the Bavli. And the Tosfot explained there. Rabbi Nisim explained in the Book of Secrets And Rabbi Nisim is Rav Nisim Gaon. He was one of the Geonim. He composed a book called Megillat Sitarim, the Book of Secrets, but only parts of it were found in the Cairo Geniza. Otherwise, well, remains a secret, I guess, that these are things that are permitted and others have practiced them as forbidden, meaning that they know they are permitted and they want to be stricter on themselves. And that is the meaning of the phrase, things that are permitted. So the question in the Talmud is, if they took it as a vow, meaning I want to abstain, I take a vow that I'm abstaining from something, is it permitted to cancel the vow? But, say the Tosfot, things that are practiced due to a mistaken belief that they are forbidden, but are actually permitted, these you can permit, right? It can be permitted for them. And this is clearly the intent, he says, the Tosfot say, in the Yerushalmi. Now, I think in our day, at least certainly in Israel, a lot of people are very aware that it's a stringency because they know so many non-Ashkenazi Jews who eat these things that it's clear that it's permitted. And so it isn't done out of ignorance, but I would say that for many generations, it's like, that's what my grandmother did, right? And they don't necessarily know permitted, not permitted. As a kid growing up, it's what we ate, or what we didn't eat, because I grew up in an Ashkenazi house. So you didn't eat these things because, well, grandma didn't eat these things. It's not because it's only later when you study more, you find out it's a stringency. He then proceeded to discuss whether the stringency of Qitniyot is in fact such a vow that can be permitted. And he cites a string of cases of customs that have been permitted. That is, like vows that have been permitted. The word lahatir, to permit, actually means to free, right? Such as matir asuri, to free those who are imprisoned, which is in our 18 benedictions, as I think it's called in English, from the Talmud and later. So lehatir, to permit, means to free someone of that vow. So he concluded that it is ignorance to claim minhag shel Yisrael Torahi. Okay, that's the expression, a custom among the people of Israel is like the Torah. As a kid in school, I was taught minhag b'Yisrael dinhu. A custom in Israel becomes a law. I'm sure that's found in texts as well. At the end of his responsum, he states that when he was young, he was more afraid of the extremists. But, quote, and now this might shed a little insight into his thinking and why he became complicit, some people might say, with the French, with the Consistoire. Now that I have come of age, and with the consent of my fellow scholars, all the winds in the world do not move me from my place. So he became, maybe with maturity, maybe with a certain recognition that life isn't as simple as the, yes, no in the books, that there are reasons to not be stringent. Someone who's less familiar with the attitudes of most rabbinical authorities at the time might wonder why this responsum had virtually no influence on the Ashkenazi Jewish community. And it didn't, though perhaps it was helpful to the soldiers who served in Napoleon's army. I'm not aware of any records. I looked somewhat, I admit I didn't search a ton, records of what those soldiers actually ate. It would be fascinating to find a diary or two of some of these soldiers. A topic for research, perhaps. But those who are familiar would guess pretty quickly that other rabbis opposed this, and particularly in the Ashkenazi community, stringency rules. We know that. Though I might add that in the atmosphere in the modern Israeli Orthodox world, the attitudes towards stringency for which Sephardi rulings are sometimes known have steeply declined. And I've seen that Well, one of the places I saw it, and I was actually quite disappointed, was during the COVID pandemic, when some of the Sephardi poskim first said it was okay to have a Pesach Seder on Zoom, so very appropriate for this time of year again. And then they reneged because there was backlash from Ashkenazi rabbis. And to me, no, don't cave in. You had good reasons for saying it was permitted. Stand like he says, all the winds in the world do not move me from my place. One of the most influential rabbinic poskim of the time, I mentioned him, was Rabbi Moshe Sofer, known by his collection of responsa, the Chatam Sofer. He was asked by the rabbi of Glogov in Yiddish, Glogov in Polish, Gluga. It's Gimel Lamed Vav Aleph in the Chatam Sofer. It's in Poland. And the rabbi there asked Rabbi Sternhardt. And the Chatam Sofer was vehemently opposed. And I will quote one brief passage that characterizes his attitude. He relates to one of Rabbi Sternhardt's points that stringencies that the people are not able to withstand should not be imposed. And he said, due to our multitude of sins, this generation has totally broken all barriers, and one must make more effort to be stricter and not to be lenient. And since the people can withstand it, he's talking about the abstention from Qitniyot, just as we have withstood it for several hundred years. And so basically, I toughed it out, they should tough it out. He wrote this in 1810. Or what would be the February 27th, 1810. So actually very shortly after the Responsa was published. I'm going to end with a quote from Rabbi Yitzchak Shmuel Reggio. He's an Italian rabbi, enlightened rabbi who lived later. He lived in the 18th and 19th centuries, but so it's not really later, but his books were published later. Anyway, he's almost a contemporary. And one of his books is called Yalkut Yashar. He studied secular studies as well, in addition to his religious studies. And this book is a collection of essays and responsa that he previously wrote. That's why I say it was published later and collected into this small volume. The discussion in his responsum, from which I am quoting or will be quoting, was about etrogim and the method they're grown and stringencies that have become the norm. And we see that. We will have here all the time bilti murkav, that it can't be somehow from a, what's the word in English for grafting, right? That's a stringency. And he said it was once the norm to not require that, and then the stringency became the norm. And this is what he says. He says, contemporary rabbis don't bother to interrogate the sources of law and custom. Instead, their purpose is to traffic in chumrot, stringencies, and create new prohibitions. They are unable to appreciate their hypocrisy. On the one hand, they roar like a lion against those who are open to change and the reformists, that one cannot alter an iota from what the Kadmonim, meaning the early sages of Rishonim, imposed, while on the other hand, casually discard the Kadmonim whenever the Achronim, those later rabbis, those after the expulsion, create new chumrot, and they fight with all their might to impose these new prohibitions. So he's saying it is just as much a reform to add stringencies to the religion as it is perhaps to not have the stringencies or to remove them or to be a little bit more lenient. Okay, does that relate? Can we open to a little discussion? How does that relate to the discussion of Qitniyot? Does it relate? Anybody? Such a quiet group. Well,
I'm going to allow everyone to talk if they'd like. And people can come in and join and yes, if anyone has ideas.
any thoughts? Any thoughts on that last statement? I mean, I think it does relate because I think it's very clear that that's an imposition of a stringency that perhaps does make a lot of people's lives more difficult. These days, a lot of times people say, well, no, we have all these different substitutes. There are people, though, that are limited in what they can eat. And by abiding by the stringency of Qitniyot, I mean, for example, all these things made with potato flour, well, all the people that have diabetes should not be eating them. So they might be better off being, eating some of these legumes rather than all this stuff made with potato flour. So I think it does relate. But the other question is, would it have been appropriate? Suppose Rabbi Sternhardt, was aware of this book and this essay or tshuva that is in the Yalkut Yashar. Would it have been appropriate for him, and would it have helped his case? Thoughts? None. It might have been appropriate, but it would have only damaged his case. He would have certainly been called reform. Basically, he was called reform, even though he was not. Personally, I view it as kind of sad, meaning his responsum is extensive in detail in all the sources. And sure, if you want to just follow what your parents, your grandparents, and so forth did, and if that's good for you, great. But there are those people who would like to find some kind of, do I really have to do that? And I think if you look at this literature, you'll see that you can contemplate, think about it, and maybe come to a different conclusion. So I'm open to questions, if there are any comments, or
I'm gonna let everyone open their cameras, their mics if they'd like, and have questions. We did have Lisa who
Lisa left.
commented before that she didn't. Lisa left, that she.
Oh, I see. I don't have an opinion
you-
per se, but it does cause me to feel more comfortable about my choices. Ah, okay. In other words, you made a choice, I'm assuming, to eat some legumes or all legumes, and now you feel better about it, that you really aren't doing anything that's prohibited. That's true. Very true. It's interesting, I knew somebody, this is years ago, as a friend of my mother's, who he had some severe health problem, serious health problem, actually. And he was very limited in what he could eat. He felt so bad about starting to eat rice or something that he was able to digest, that he went through this as if he converted to become a Sephardi. Now, there is no such thing really, but it made him feel better about changing this rather than just saying, I have a real good reason that I have to eat rice. It really isn't prohibited. It made him feel better. But I remember hearing about the fact that some rabbi went along with this idea and went through some kind of procedure of him absolving him of his vows as if he took a vow. I mean, we don't really take a vow. We're born into this, right? So if we're born into an Ashkenazi family, we didn't take a vow to not eat these things. We just, as kids, grew up not eating these things. But he went through this and it did make him feel better. So I always think studying and understanding the sources. In fact, that's how I became interested in halakha. You hear all kinds of stringencies, and this is allowed and this isn't allowed, and this yes and that not. And I wanted very much to understand, where did this come from? How did it develop? So that's really how I became interested in this line of study.
Thank you. So and now if anyone has questions, you're welcome to ask. I have a question, but I'll keep it if see if others have first, and then
I have a
I'll
question.
yeah.
Um, so what is the difference? I mean, if you're sick on Yom Kippur, you're allowed to eat, or if there's some medicine that you have to take that's not kosher for Pekuach Nefesh, you can do anything for your health.
That's right.
So why is this different? Or why couldn't it just, why you don't have to be Sephardi? Why couldn't he just say for health reasons he couldn't eat that? Even there's a rule for people who can't eat regular matzah on Pesach. So why is this different?
Well, okay, interesting question. This is different because the soldiers, so if he just did it for the soldiers and said these people would starve to death if they don't eat legumes, then you might say it's pikuach nefesh. But what he did is he went ahead and said all people in Westphalia, all Jews, not people, all Jews in Westphalia should be permitted. Well, they do have other things to eat. The rest of the people, it's not a matter of pikuach nefesh. In the case that I told of my mother's friend, who he actually had health reasons, and no, he did not need to go through some kind of ceremony to become Sephardi. That just kind of made him feel good. It's the same way you're permitted to drink on Yom Kippur if you're sick, but there are people sick or will get sick, okay, even if you're not sick. But if you're somebody that if you don't drink, you will have a kidney problem or something. And yet there are people who nevertheless will end up drinking little measured amounts at a time because it makes them feel that they're not transgressing. And the reality is they're not. They need it for their health. And but sometimes people are so ingrained with feeling guilty that it's not necessarily so easy. And in the case here, though, he came out because it's clear that there really isn't a justification. I didn't quote this, but when we first see in our sources about this custom, it's the son of the Rosh, the Tur, who says, which, I mean, we're going back to the 11th century, who says it's a minhag shtut, it's a nonsensical custom. So there is no real justification for it. It started in some Ashkenazi communities and it spread for whatever reason. There is a tendency, was and still is among many Ashkenazi communities, to be, oh, there's something that I can be more devoted, more stringent. We see this today with another thing on Pesach, the custom of not eating what in Yiddish are called gebrochts. Sephardim don't have this at all. Ashkenazim, it used to only be certain Hasidic groups. And yet in Israel, my goodness, I mean, you can't, it's hard to find anything commercially made anymore that has gebrochts because these stringencies spread. And that's what happened with Qitniyot. But there really is no reason. So he's correct when he says, he didn't go out and say all Jews in the world. He just said Jews in Westphalia because that's the Jewish community that he's responsible for. But nevertheless, people saw it in other Jewish communities, and people like the Chatan Sofer, who had a lot of weight, he ended up prevailing. And basically, this did not become accepted in the Ashkenazi community. But I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
So Suzanne also just noted that she had to leave, but she was very interested. So we'll take another 3 minutes if somebody has another question, and then we'll wrap up.
Or you could tell us your question.
Yes. Yeah, no, but I do see a hand. But Amelia, you have a question?
A comment. As far as gebrocht, there's no longer a reason for it, but it used to be the matzahs were made differently and they were much thicker. So the possibility of that they come in contact with liquid.
There never was such a prohibition. There never was a concern about thick matzot. Just didn't exist because once it is baked for the up to under 20 minutes, it is considered not chametz, period. It's not a matter of what can happen to it. It is a halachic state. It is just like, actually, in many ways, in the Torah, you have the idea of a house that has leprosy. It's not leprosy, but the word is translated in English as leprosy. The house doesn't have leprosy until the Kohen comes in and declares it to have this. So the people who live in this house are permitted to take out everything from the house before the Kohen gets there. The moment the Kohen gets there and says it is a house with leprosy, you can't take anything out anymore. Did the physical state of those things change at all? Absolutely not. And
So
that's
there was
the same thing with the matzah.
So there's never a rationale for it, then?
Gebrochts, that's
Yeah.
the rationale, but it's a wrong rationale. The matzah is now not chametz. Once it is baked, you have a minimum amount of time that the dough can be kneaded, a minimum amount of time that it goes in the oven, and a minimum amount of time that it's baked. And once you meet those requirements, finished. It's not chametz.
Thank you. Because I know sometimes when I make cake and if I'm mixing it by hand, all the flour doesn't necessarily get integrated. So I figured, okay, I get it. But if that's not then I'm perplexed how this ever started.
There are because people come, I mean, it was only certain Hasidic groups, that's all, which means from the time of Hasidism, which is late, never existed before that. And there are still, I mean, Hasidic groups, there is now among, I think it's Chabad does this, there are people that hold their matzah in plastic, lest somehow the sweat from their fingers make it, people come up with these things, but there isn't a real basis for it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Reduce the stress. I'm very in favor of reducing the stress of Pesach. It shouldn't be so stressful.
You'll have a lot of people to convince of that. So I'll just ask my question unless somebody else has one, and then we'll finish. So when you were quoting the response, basically, the first part of the response was asking about the fermentation of the legumes, and they quote the Talmud, you said.
That's right.
Why not? And I think it actually ties in with one of the other quotes from later on. Why not test it themselves or check with some scientists or something? Why was that the first goal?
Because that's how halakha works, basically, and it may be logical or not logical, right? It may be scientific or not, but halakha works that way, meaning if all of these sages in the Talmud say it does not ferment, finished, it does not ferment. We don't have to. I mean, the attitude, and right or wrong, the attitude in the halakhic process is the sages already asked this question. They already answered this question. Who are we to say that they were wrong? And besides, in this case, why would you look for why would you look to make something prohibited when it wasn't? What, are you looking for a new problem? Well, so we see, yeah, those people that come up with gebrochts, yeah, they seem to be looking for a new problem, but why look for a problem? They already said it's fine.
Okay, so thank you. Unless we have another question, I think we're gonna wrap up. Amalia.
Yeah. Was this no? Is this being recorded where we can share it with some of our friends who keep gebrochts?
Oh,
yes,
don't get into family fights. That's
it was recorded and we will share it. So
thank you.
Our YouTube,
okay, it's not worth getting into family fights. It's 1 week. You go home and you eat your brownies made with matzah meal and all the yummy kugels and matzah balls and all those things that we ate, but it's not worth getting into fights.
Yes. So thank you very much, and thank you for all who joined. And as we said, this will be on our YouTube channel, so if people want to check it out later and review it.
Okay, oh, and a quick, if anybody does want that article, a link to the article about Napoleon and,
You can send it to myself or to Drora, and we'll send it with the follow-up email.
okay, all right, very good.
Okay, have a
Right.
good day,
Good
everyone.
evening or good afternoon, everybody.